Good morning. The title of the sermon is David and Goliath, Two Perspectives. I want to begin with a video that lots and lots of people have seen all over the world, and we'll just watch it. That 17-year-old girl really does love her dogs. Lots of people have said this is like a David and Goliath story, right? That she's the David and the bear is the Goliath, and that's what the story is about, right? Against long odds, God brings forth the good outcome, and we'll come back to that. But that's certainly one way to look at the story and one way to look at this video. But there's another way. If you've been around over the last 5 years, that's how long I've been here. It's hard to believe. You've heard me preach frequently bringing up Malcolm Gladwell. He's probably my favorite contemporary writer, scientist. He was born in England, and he came to Canada, and then he's been living in the United States for the last 25 years. And he's become among the most successful writers in the world over the last 21 years. His first book was called The Tipping Point, published in the year 2000. It was voted the best book of the decade by Amazon.com readers. That's a lot of people for the 10 years of 2000 to 2010. He's written a number of other books. They almost all have to do with a different way of seeing. They say that he's like this outside-the-box person who sees things differently, and he just shares this different way of seeing. And so his books, Blink, Outliers, What the Dog Saw, all speak to different ways of seeing things in kind of surprising ways. They're all bestsellers. They're all wonderful books. His most recent book is Talking to Strangers. You know, we don't generally talk to strangers, but he talks about in talking with strangers, we learn things because we pick up perspectives that are different than our circle of community. Outside the box thinking happens because you talk to people and they represent a wide range of ideas. So he has been described as the ultimate outside the box thinker. If everybody has to think outside the box, then maybe it is the box that needs to be examined. Great quote. And that speaks to his particular experience. In 2013, he wrote a book called David and Goliath. And it's an amazing book. I love them all, but I have to say I probably love this the most. It's also a deeply religious book. He was not a religious person before he started this book. This book really transformed him. He's a practicing Episcopalian, very, very active now. And it was his research. And what he does in this book, a number of things he does, but one of the things he does is he looks at the story of David and Goliath right from the scriptures and really analyzes it. And so you can find the story in 1 Samuel 16 and 17. It's a long story, kind of like last week we looked at Noah's Ark. Long story, 4 long chapters. Well, this is 2 very long chapters. It tells about David and Goliath, and that's where you get this story. And if we read it all, it would take a good long time. And I'm going to point at some different things, but I'd like you to go home, or if you are at home afterwards, and are interested, read those 2 chapters and just see if the things that Malcolm Gladwell comes up with that I'm going to share with you, if they are in alignment with what you read. So one of the things he does, and probably the fastest way to get at his perspective, is to look at the Goliath and at David and what the scriptures say. And so we're just going to walk through the things that come out of the scriptures. He's 6'9" or taller. There's a little bit of ambiguity about how tall he is based on the measurements, but he's at least 6'9" at a time when the average height was probably 5.5 feet. I mean, he is way over a foot taller than the average person, maybe more than that. He's a legendary warrior. He's a warrior. He's been a warrior from his youth. This idea that he's not a kid at all. He's probably not in his 20s, maybe 30s, maybe even 40s. I mean, he's this legendary person, and he's so huge and big. Everybody knows about him. Everybody heard stories about his power, his success as a warrior. He wore full armor, both top and bottom, weighing at least 100 pounds. He was armed with a sword and a spear for sure, maybe a javelin, although the javelin and the spear may very well be the same. Now, what it says is that this spear or javelin has an iron point weighing 1,500 shekels. Those are coins, 1,500 coins, which would weigh right around 16 pounds. Now, here's the deal. It's insane to have a javelin or a spear that you throw that has a point that weighs 16 pounds. It's insane. Nobody, not even Goliath, can throw this very far at all. A typical spear weighs 3 pounds. In other words, this is not a spear to throw. This is a spear to maybe jab people with, or it's really a spear to show. It's to show people how tough you are. It's kind of a facade. But anyway, that's what it says about it. He wore a bronze helmet, which would have had an open front because that's the way helmets were at that time. He requires a shield bearer, another person to lead him and to carry equipment. And so in the picture you see there's Goliath and there's his shield bearer. Okay. 3 times in the scriptures, it says that Goliath says, "Come to me. Come to me." I mean, he doesn't know the person's name is David. He wants his opponent to come to him. You come to me. Yeah. He expects to fight in hand-to-hand combat. There's no question that's what he is set up for. Again, especially when you think about this spear javelin that has a 16-pound iron point, right? He wants that person in his wheelhouse, I guess you would say. Everything he says is intended to intimidate. I mean, he is loud and brash, and he's gonna take their flesh and feed it to the vultures. And he talks big. He refers to David. He doesn't know his name, but he sees his opponent. When he sees him, he says, "You come to me fighting with sticks?" Fighting with sticks? Yeah. Like I'm a dog, I mean, just this crazy stuff, right? Sticks. He walks into battle, in contrast to David, who runs quickly. And you almost get a sense that he kind of lumbers into battle. He's got this shield bearer that carries things, and he's loaded down with all this armor. I mean, he kind of slowly goes into battle, whereas David runs quickly. All right, so that's Goliath. All that stuff comes from the scriptures. David. David is the youngest of Jesse's 8 sons. He's skilled as a musician. He plays the harp. He worked as a shepherd, and shepherds worked alone. So he was used to being on his own. It says he was chosen by God, and when it says that, it says he was contrasted with his older brothers, saying, God looks not at one's stature, but rather as humans do, but instead God looks at the heart. So clearly he had a lot of heart or maybe a lot of passion, but his stature, it's why he's often referred to as small. And finally, he's referred to by Goliath as little more than a boy. Doesn't say how old he is, but the best guess is, he's maybe 15, 16 years old. All right, he's skilled with a sling because it says that he alone, caring for his sheep, protecting his sheep, killed lions and bears. That's probably mountain lions, but he killed lions and bears on his own. And it says that when Saul, when he's selected or when he volunteers to go up against Goliath, Saul says, "Oh, I get you some armor. I'll put some armor on you." So he puts this full armor on David, and and David is willing to try it on. But as soon as he gets it on, he says, "This ain't going to work." He says, and he rejects it because it limits his mobility. He's going to run in contrast to Goliath walking. He needs to be nimble. So he rejects. It's his choice. He rejects it. Finally, the only weapons he takes with him are a sling and a staff. And you can see those in the picture. And that's what he carries with him all the time. That's what he has with him. That's like almost an extension of his body. Those two things, very familiar. A few things about slings. This is a typical sling. You would wear one, that little loop would go around your finger. The other you would hold, you would pinch, and you would spin it around. And you could easily spin it 6 revolutions per second. And at that, when you let go of it, the projectile will speed over 100 miles an hour. Slings are incredible weapons. They have the killing force of a bullet. With practice, high accuracy, and often they were pretty good at like 20, 25 feet, 30 feet. Within 15 to 20 feet, they were almost surefire. Now that's with a lot of practice. Of course, David hit the head of a bear, hit the head of a lion. So he's pretty good. Now, warfare in that era. And actually, it's interesting because the Philistines and the Israelites were kind of deadlocked for a couple weeks in this great big valley. They kind of realized that they could basically annihilate each other and maybe have no victor but kill a good many of both sides. And they don't really want to do that. And so the Philistines come up with this idea, let's just have one person from each side. This was a common thing to resolve this. And the one who wins is the victor. The one who loses, the person who loses, that side loses. Now, there were 3 forms of warfare in the area. There was cavalry, using horses and chariots. Those were kind of the big guns. There was artillery. These were people that were, in the back, and then they would shoot, archers, but also slingers, equally deadly. And finally, there was the heavy infantry. This was people like Goliath. They were armed. They often had armor on them, and it was literally hand-to-hand combat. It was just brutal, like gladiators, pretty much. And so those were the 3 basically forms of warfare. Now, what's real clear is Goliath is only prepared for number 3. That is he's a gladiator, and he's a legendary gladiator. In fact, he's such a great gladiator, his legend is so big, he talks such a good game, my guess is he probably rarely has to fight. All the Israelites were coward. None of them wanted to fight except for David. That was probably typical. This huge, huge guy, legendary, but only set up for number 3. David is set up for number 2. David responds with number 2, but in close range. He's not going to at 100 feet or even 50 feet or even 30 feet, but he's going to be able to he can probably get into like 10 feet because Goliath has nothing to project outward. He's got this stupid spear with a 16-pound head that, you could see him coming a mile. You could see it easily coming. David could easily elude that. That's all he's got. Otherwise, he's set up for hand-to-hand combat. But David's set up for something different. Now, Gladwell, he gets into this, and he's never really done much biblical study, and he just gets into it. He's a scholar. He's good at that stuff, and so he discovers all these other things. And one of them that really jumped out at him was Goliath's eyesight. Gladwell shares that there was biblical scholarship going back to 1964 that suggests that Goliath may have had acromegaly. Acromegaly is a disease that causes abnormal growth, but often has the side effect of restricted sight. Now, before we get to that saw sticks, just a note that most of people that are extraordinarily tall, a great many of them have this disease. And it it's hard on the body. And often people don't live a long, long time. But there's also one principal side effect of restricted eyesight, and often double vision. Now, the sticks. Goliath says, as David approaches, why do you come after me, fighting with sticks, like I'm a dog you're going to beat with sticks? The only problem is David doesn't have sticks. He's got one staff, and he's got a sling. He's got one stick. And Goliath thinks he has two. Now, maybe, just maybe, he wasn't looking very carefully, but maybe he had horrible eyesight. Maybe he had this disease and he saw double vision, which would suggest that, he's half blind. So when he says, come to me, that's because, my gosh, if you don't come to me, I can't even see you. The only way he can beat David is if David comes to him and fights on his terms. David doesn't do that. All right, so putting it all together, Gladwell says this: Goliath is big and slow. He's a loud, arrogant bully. And he's really good at being bullied. A bully, he talks a big game. He's loud. And he's this giant. So, you can't help but kind of take note of him. On the other hand, David is small, fast, and he's skilled, but no one really knows about his skill. That's right. He's been a shepherd working by himself, and he's developed this extraordinary skill with a sling. And David takes advantage of being underestimated. That's right. Absolutely takes advantage of it. The next thing is, Gladwell says, is David defines the fight. It's not that Goliath gives it over to David. No. Goliath, he wants to define the fight. Come to me. And if Goliath defines the fight, David will be annihilated. He will just be annihilated. He'll be gone in 15 seconds. However, because David defines the fight, guess what? It's over in 15 seconds because Goliath is a sitting duck. The odds are unbelievably in favor of David. Not Goliath, but David. Now, what happened for Gladwell is when he does all this research, it blows him away. This is not the story that he thought it was. He thought it was just the opposite, that all the odds favored Goliath, and God goes against the odds and takes the underdog who is just outgunned, outmatched. The odds are unbelievably against him, and against long odds, the underdog prevails. That's what he thought the story was about. But he said, that's not the story of David and Goliath. When you really look at the scriptures and really think about what it's saying, it's very different. It's just the opposite. It's different. And so here's what he learns. The world naturally defers to loud, arrogant bullies, and these approaches are seen as a given. They represent the status quo. We tend to think in terms of status quo. That's why we give so much power to giants. Most of the big problems are the creation of the status quo. So that's the consequence. The status quo, the problems that are there have been created by what has been happening. That's the way it's been. The status quo represents what is. Underdogs think outside the box, outside of the status quo. Why? Because they have to. If David goes in status quo, he's lunch meat. He's forced outside the box. But that's the power of underdogs. God works through underdogs because underdogs are much more effective than loud, arrogant bullies to change the status quo. Loud, arrogant bullies can't change the status quo. They can only enlarge the status quo. Well, this really affected him. And it was a shock to him, the incredible insights that he discovered in the scriptures. And it was an epiphany for him. And it led him back to his roots, his Mennonite roots, his Christian roots. and it led him to Jesus. When he published the book, this change was happening. He doesn't talk about it in the book, but he shares it very openly in a number of interviews. What if David and Goliath truly represent the way God works? Jesus, he realizes clearly, is strongly identified as being in the line of David. To understand Jesus, you have to understand David. And now he understands David. It's a very different David than he thought. Jesus is the ultimate underdog. Jesus redefines the playing field. The things of this world will all pass away, but the kingdom of God is eternal. Jesus is not a loud, arrogant bully. He doesn't use bullying. He becomes an absorber of the violence of the world, doesn't put out more violence. Jesus is humble, compassionate, and loving, things the world views as weak. There are many, many scriptures that communicate this about Jesus that were important to Malcolm Gladwell. This is just one of many. I'm just going to read it. It doesn't need a whole lot of explanation. You can see the connection. From Philippians 2, if there is any encouragement in Christ, any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, any compassion and sympathy, make my joy complete. Be of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interest, but to the interest of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and even became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. That's the model. Now back to the bear story. When people made the comparison and said, the 17-year-old girl was like a David, and against, this enormous odds, she prevailed. And in some ways, that understanding does describe this. This was against long odds. This 17-year-old girl said she did not realize it was a bear. All she saw was something was attacking her dog. She loves her dogs, and she went after it. And afterwards, she realized, I just pushed a bear. I just pushed a bear off the wall. If you watched it, you saw the power of a bear's claws. It catches it looks like just the lip maybe of the big dog, and the dog runs yelping. A bear will tear your face off. I saw a number of experts that know about bears protecting their young, which is what this is about. And they said that, 99 out of 100 times, this girl has her face torn off. She is killed by this bear or maimed beyond belief. That this is a fluke. It's a fluke. This is the story of David and Goliath traditionally against these enormous odds. God takes David and defies the odds. Like this woman, this girl defied the odds. And they're saying, please don't do this, please don't do this. This is 1 in a million sort of stuff, all right? So there's two views of David and Goliath. There's the traditional view, like the girl and the bear. God chooses underdogs against long odds. That's the way I thought of David and Goliath. Probably most of us did. That's the way Malcolm Gladwell thought before he really looked at the scriptures. And then there's the Malcolm Gladwell view, kind of the Jesus view. God chooses underdogs because underdogs work outside the box, which is the only way to change the status quo. Again, David uses the status quo. He's lunch meat. He goes outside the box because he's an underdog. Last week we looked at Noah's Ark, and the message was of sustainability. You almost can't read that story and not realize that God is a God who desires and seeks and hopes and plans for sustainability, and we're to be a part of that. The story of Noah's Ark suggests that sustainability truly is close to the heart of God. I got tons of feedback from the sermon. Somehow it spoke to a lot of us are thinking about sustainability, and that sustainability includes not just, for some it includes climate change, for other includes farmers that aren't going to have water for their farms. I mean, the whole range of different systems that are insustainable. We looked at, Lake Mead down 160 feet. Something's going to have to change because it's insustainable. It's going away. What is going to happen to all those farmers and people that use the water and the fish that need the water to survive? You look at what's happening with glaciers. For many people, you realize that this is insustainable. We looked at the way David Attenborough, this is the game changer for him. Just 15, 20 years ago, the Great Barrier Reef that you see the way it was even as recently as 2000, the year 2000, and the way large sections of it are today, and all the systems, all the fish life, all the stuff that has gone away. It's insustainable. Increasingly, there is a consensus that many crucial systems are becoming unsustainable, systems that we are dependent upon for life. Outside the box thinking is what it will take to get us out of this place of unsustainability. The 7.8 billion people on earth cannot be bullied into seeking sustainability. You can't force people to change the status quo. The status quo has this inertia. You can't bully people to change it. What it takes is an internal recognition of something more important. We talked about shalom being not just what's good for me, but what's good for my children and my children's children and my children's children's children. It will take outside the box, non-coercive, internally driven, shalom, future-oriented, broadly cooperative thinking to move toward sustainability. Exactly what you find in Jesus. And so I left with two questions last week. I'd kind of like to keep them fresh. Is sustainability close to your heart? And think of all the things that sustainability speaks to. And if so, what are you going to do about it? And today we add this. The right model is clear. The biblical model is very clear. It's the model of David. It's the model of Jesus. Amen.